April 19th, 1989. A Wednesday night in New York City, somewhere in Central Park, a 28-year-old woman is running alone. She is an investment banker. She went to Yale. She runs this route 3 or 4 times a week. By the time anyone finds her, she has lost 75% of her blood. Her skull is fractured in multiple places. She will spend 2 weeks in a coma. She will never remember what happened to her. Within 48 hours, the New York City Police Department will arrest 5 boys. Not men, boys. They are 14, 15, and 16 years old. They are Black and Latino. They come from Harlem. And within days, every single one of them will confess to a crime that none of them committed. Most people who hear this story for the first time have already made up their minds by now. They've already decided who the villains are. But here's the thing about this case. Over 35 years later, depending on who you ask, the villains change. To understand what happened that night in Central Park, you have to understand the city that surrounded it. Because this isn't just a crime story. It's a story about what happens when an entire city, an entire country, is so afraid that it will sacrifice its own children to feel safe. New York City in 1989 was a city at war with itself. The crack cocaine epidemic had torn through entire neighborhoods like a wildfire that nobody could put out. In that single year, New York recorded more than 2,000 homicides, the highest in its history. Subway cars were covered in graffiti. Times Square was a place parents warned their children about. The city that had once been a symbol of American ambition had become a symbol of American decay. The numbers alone told a story that made people afraid to leave their apartments. Nearly 400,000 serious crimes were reported in New York City that year. A murder happened, on average, every 4 hours. Crack had decimated entire blocks in Harlem, the Bronx, and Brooklyn, turning buildings into shells and streets into open-air drug markets. The city's homeless population had swelled past 30,000, and the racial tension that had been simmering for decades was boiling over. In December 1986, a group of white men had beaten 3 black men in Howard Beach, Queens, chasing one of them into traffic where he was killed. The city had not recovered. It was not clear that it would. And in the middle of all of it, Central Park sat like a green island surrounded by fear. The park that Frederick Law Olmsted had designed as a democratic space, a place where rich and poor, black and white, could share the same grass and the same sky, had become something else entirely. By 1989, Central Park was a symbol of everything New Yorkers were afraid of. Muggings, assaults, the feeling that no place was safe anymore. Joggers carried whistles. Dog walkers avoided the northern end after dark. The park that was supposed to belong to everyone had become a place that felt like it belonged to no one. This was the world that 5 boys woke up in every morning. Antron McCray was 15. He lived in Harlem with his parents. His stepfather, Bobby McCray, worked hard to keep the family together. Antron played Little League baseball. He was quiet. He was the kind of kid teachers described as polite. Kevin Richardson was 15. He played the trumpet in his school band. He was small for his age, barely 5 feet tall, and maybe 100 pounds. His older sister, Angela, would later describe him as the baby of the family, the one everyone looked out for. Yusef Salaam was 15. He was tall, thoughtful, and deeply curious. He dreamed of being a rapper or a designer. His mother, Sharon, was raising him in Harlem and had given him a strong sense of identity and faith. He carried a student transit card that listed his age. That detail would matter later. Raymond Santana was 14, the youngest. He was being raised by his grandmother in East Harlem after his mother moved to Puerto Rico. He liked to draw. He was a small kid with a big imagination. The kind of boy who disappeared into his own world with a sketch pad and a pencil. And then there was Korey Wise. Korey was 16, the oldest by a year, and that single year would cost him everything. Korey had a learning disability. He had trouble hearing. He struggled in school but had people who loved him and looked out for him. Unlike the others, Korey wasn't even a suspect that night. He went to the police precinct voluntarily because his friend Yusef had been taken in for questioning, and Korey wanted to make sure he was okay. It was an act of loyalty, the kind of thing a good friend does without thinking. He walked through those doors because he cared about someone. He would not walk out a free person for 13 years. These were not hardened criminals. These were not gang members or drug dealers. These were children who played baseball and drew pictures and practiced the trumpet and dreamed about the future. Some of them knew each other, some of them didn't. What they had in common was that they were young, they were not white, and they were in Central Park on the wrong night. But what happened next would turn all of that into irrelevance. Because once the machine started, it didn't matter who they were. It only mattered what they looked like and what the city needed them to be. On the evening of April 19, 1989, roughly 30 teenagers entered Central Park from the north side, near 110th Street. Some of them were there to hang out. Some were there to cause trouble. A few of them harassed joggers, threw rocks at cars, and took food from a homeless man. The police would later call this wilding, a word that none of the teenagers actually used, but that the media would turn into a weapon. That same night, Trisha Meili went for her run. What the police found was a scene of extraordinary violence. Meili had been beaten so badly that her left eye was pushed back into its socket. She had been bound with her own shirt. She was found in a ravine, partially hidden by brush, covered in mud and blood. The attack was savage, deliberate, and deeply personal. New York City erupted. The tabloids went to war. The New York Post ran headlines about wolf packs. The Daily News printed the boys' names and faces, something that would normally be prohibited for minors. But in the spring of 1989, the rules didn't seem to apply. Pat Buchanan went on television and called for the oldest boy to be horsewhipped. A city councilman compared the boys to animals. And on May 1, 1989, less than 2 weeks after the attack, a full-page advertisement appeared in 4 New York City newspapers. It was written by Donald Trump, at that time a real estate developer worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The ad's headline was, in all capital letters, "Bring back the death penalty. Bring back our police." The ad did not name the 5 boys. It didn't need to. Everyone knew who it was about. Trump paid $85,000 for those ads. When asked about them on CNN, he told Larry King, "Of course I hate these people, and let's all hate these people, because maybe hate is what we need if we're gonna get something done." The 5 boys had not yet been tried. They had not yet stood before a jury. They had only been arrested, and already one of the most famous men in America was calling for their execution. But what happened inside those police precincts in the hours after the arrests was even worse than what happened in the newspapers. The boys were brought in for questioning on the night of April 19th and into April 20th. They were interrogated for between 14 and 30 hours. They were not given food or given food only sporadically. They were not given water for long stretches. They were told they were not under arrest, that they were just there to help, to answer a few questions, and then they could go home. Their parents were either not present during the actual questioning or were kept in separate rooms. Antron McCray's stepfather, Bobby, was in the precinct but was told that if Antron just cooperated, they could all go home. Bobby McCray would later say that a detective told him, "If your son doesn't admit to it, he's going to get 15 to life." Bobby went into the room and told his 15-year-old stepson, to tell the police what they wanted to hear. Yusef Salaam's mother, Sharon, arrived at the precinct and demanded to see her son. She was told to wait. She brought Yusef's transit card, which showed his birth date, proving he was 15, a minor who should not be questioned without a parent present. The detective had already been questioning him for hours. When Sharon finally got to him and told the police to stop, the damage was already done. Korey Wise was questioned without a parent, without a lawyer, and without anyone who could have told him that he didn't have to say a word. He was 16 and had a hearing impairment and a learning disability. He was the most vulnerable person in that precinct, and he received the least protection. None of the interrogations were recorded from the beginning. This is a critical detail. The police turned on the cameras only after the boys had been questioned for many hours. After they had been worn down, told what the police believed had happened, told what their friends had supposedly said about them, and coached on the narrative that the detectives wanted to hear. What the cameras captured were exhausted, terrified children, some of them barely able to keep their eyes open, reciting versions of events that had been constructed for them by the adults in the room. And the stories didn't match. Antron McCray said the attack happened in one location. Raymond Santana described a completely different spot. Korey Wise placed himself somewhere else entirely. They contradicted each other on timing, on sequence, on who did what. Not one of them could accurately describe the victim. Not one of them led police to the crime scene correctly. The confessions were not the stories of people who had committed a crime together. They were the stories of children who had been told what to say and couldn't keep the details straight because they hadn't been there. But none of that mattered, because New York City had its suspects, and New York City wanted blood. Every single one of the 5 boys recanted his confession within days. Every single one of them said the same thing, that the detectives had told them what to say, had promised them they could go home if they just repeated the story, had pressured and frightened them into compliance. And every single one of them was ignored. There was one more piece of evidence that should have stopped everything. The forensic team had collected DNA from the crime scene, semen found on Trisha Mealy's body and clothing. In 1989, DNA testing was already sophisticated enough to provide definitive results. The lab tested the samples against all 5 boys. Not a single one of them matched. The DNA belonged to someone else entirely, someone who was not in custody, someone the police had not even considered. The prosecution knew this, and they moved forward anyway. What happened next would consume 2 courtrooms, 2 juries, and what was left of 5 childhoods. The trial of the Central Park 5, or more accurately, the 2 trials, began in the summer of 1990. The defendants were split into 2 groups. Antron McCray, Yusef Salaam, and Raymond Santana were tried first. Kevin Richardson and Korey Wise were tried second. The prosecution was led by Elizabeth Lederer, an experienced assistant district attorney who had been assigned to the case by Linda Fairstein, the head of the Manhattan District Attorney's Sex Crimes Unit. Fairstein had taken control of the investigation from the very beginning. She had been at the precinct during the interrogations, she had directed the strategy, and she had made a decision that would define the case. She would build the prosecution entirely around the confessions. Lederer's approach was methodical and devastating. She played the videotaped confessions for the jury, those exhausted, frightened boys reciting words that didn't match each other, describing a crime they couldn't locate on a map. But Lederer did something shrewd. She didn't ask the jury to believe that every detail in every confession was accurate. Instead, she wove the confessions into the larger narrative of that night. The other incidents in the park, the harassment of joggers, the general chaos. She painted a picture of escalating violence. She told the jury that these boys had gone into the park looking for trouble, and the attack on Trisha Mealy was the inevitable result. The courtroom was packed every day. Protesters stood outside, divided along racial lines that were becoming a defining feature of the case. Inside, the defense attorneys attacked the confessions as coerced. They pointed out the contradictions, and there were many. One boy said the attack happened near the reservoir. Another said it was near the 102nd Street transverse. A third placed it somewhere else entirely. None of them described the victim's clothing correctly. None of them accurately described her injuries. The timelines they gave were impossible, placing the boys in locations where other evidence proved they could not have been. The defense called attention to the conditions of the interrogations. 14-year-old Raymond Santana had been questioned for hours without food. 15-year-old Antron McCray's stepfather had been pressured by detectives to tell his own son to confess. 16-year-old Korey Wise, with a hearing impairment and a learning disability, had been questioned without a parent or lawyer at any point. These were not the confessions of willing participants. These were the words of frightened children who had been told in various ways that the only way out of that room was through compliance. And then there was the DNA. The defense made sure the jury heard it. The semen found on Trisha Mealy did not match any of the 5 defendants, not one. The prosecution's own forensic evidence excluded every single boy sitting at the defense table. The prosecution's response was remarkable. They acknowledged the DNA mismatch, and then simply suggested that there must have been a 6th attacker who was never caught, someone who was part of the group but escaped. An unnamed, unknown figure who left his DNA behind, while 5 innocent teenagers were blamed for his crime. They offered no evidence for this theory, no witness, no physical proof, just the suggestion. And then they went back to the confessions. The jury watched those tapes and saw what they had been told to see. Guilty boys confessing to a terrible crime. They did not see what the defense was trying to show them, that a confession is only as reliable as the process that produced it, and this process was broken from the very first hour. Here is the question that defined this case in 1990 and still defines it today. If 5 teenagers independently confess to the same crime, how can all 5 of them be innocent? It's a reasonable question. Most people, when they first hear it, think there must be something there. You don't confess to something you didn't do. Not once. Certainly not 5 times. But here's what that question doesn't account for. What happens to a 14-year-old boy when he is taken from his home in the middle of the night, placed in a room with adult detectives who are trained in the art of psychological pressure, denied food and water and sleep, separated from his parents, told that his friends have already named him, told that he can go home if he just tells them what they want to hear, and kept in that room for 14, 20, 25, 30 hours, until the only thought in his exhausted mind is, say anything, just make it stop. 575 people have been exonerated by DNA evidence in the United States since 1989. Of those who were wrongfully convicted, nearly 30% had given false confessions. The human mind, under enough pressure, will confess to anything. It will confess to crimes that never happened. It will confess to murders that occurred in cities the confessor has never visited. It will confess because the body is exhausted and the mind is broken, and the only door out of the room is the one that opens when you say the words they want you to say. This is not theory. This is documented, studied, proven fact. The jury did not know any of this. In 1990, the science of false confessions barely existed. The jury heard 5 boys say, "I did it," and that was enough. All 5 were convicted. Antron McCray, Kevin Richardson, Yusef Salaam, and Raymond Santana were sentenced as juveniles, 5 to 10 years each. They would serve between 5 and 7 years behind bars, but Korey Wise was 16, just old enough to be tried as an adult. The boy who had walked into that precinct voluntarily, who had gone there to support his friend, who had never been a suspect until he showed up at the door, was sentenced to 5 to 15 years in an adult prison. He served 13 years in Rikers Island and Attica, and a series of other facilities designed for hardened adult criminals, not for a teenager who had walked into a police station because he was worried about his friend. Korey was beaten by other inmates. He was placed in solitary confinement for his own protection, which meant spending 23 hours a day alone in a cell the size of a bathroom. He was transferred from facility to facility. He watched the world change through the narrow window of a cell, while the other 4, sentenced as juveniles, were released one by one into a world that had moved on without them. Raymond Santana got out and was sent back in on a drug charge, the kind of spiral that follows so many young men who enter the system as children and emerge with nothing. Antron McCray moved to a different state, changed his name, and tried to disappear. Kevin Richardson came home to a neighborhood that had changed, and a family that had been hollowed out by years of fighting a system that wouldn't listen. Yusef Salaam came out with his faith intact, but with 7 years of his life gone. The years between 15 and 22, the years when most people figure out who they are going to be. And Korey Wise, the one who had walked in voluntarily, the one who had done nothing except show up for a friend, was still inside, year after year after year. And then, in 2001, a man named Matias Reyes changed everything. Reyes was a convicted serial rapist and murderer, serving a sentence of 33 years to life. He had been captured in August 1989, just 4 months after the Central Park attack, for a string of rapes and a murder in the same area of Manhattan. He had raped a woman in Central Park just 2 days before the attack on Mellie. The police knew about him. The detective who arrested Reyes later said he had wondered about a possible connection to the jogger case, but by August 1989, the city had its 5 suspects. The case was closed. Nobody went back to check. For 12 years, Reyes said nothing. Then, in 2001, he encountered Korey Wise in prison. Something about seeing the man whose life he had destroyed, the man who was serving time for a crime that Reyes himself had committed, moved him to finally speak. He went to the authorities and confessed to the Central Park attack. He said he had acted alone. He provided details that only the attacker could have known, details that none of the 5 boys had ever been able to provide in their so-called confessions. The DNA was tested again. This time, it was matched against Reyes. It was a perfect match. The semen that had been found on Trisha Meili in 1989, the semen that had excluded all 5 boys, belonged to Matias Reyes. He had been right there in the system the entire time, arrested 4 months after the attack, convicted of nearly identical crimes in the same part of the city, sitting in a prison cell while 5 innocent men sat in theirs. And no one, not the police, not the prosecutors, not the system that was supposed to find the truth, had put it together. On December 19, 2002, Justice Charles Tejada of the New York Supreme Court vacated all 5 convictions, 13 years after they were arrested, after a combined 41 years behind bars. After 5 childhoods were erased, 5 families were destroyed, and 5 boys became men inside concrete walls for a crime they had nothing to do with. They were free. But free is a complicated word when you've lost everything. When you walk out of a courthouse at 28 or 30 years old, and the world expects you to start a life that you were never given the tools to build. When your 20s, the decade most people spend going to college, starting careers, falling in love, making mistakes that don't cost them everything, were spent behind bars for something you didn't do. In the years that followed, the 5 men, who now called themselves the Exonerated 5, filed a civil lawsuit against the city of New York. The case dragged on for over a decade. The city fought it. Lawyers argued. Documents were buried and discovered and argued over again. In 2014, the city finally settled for $41 million, roughly $1 million for each year of imprisonment. It was the largest settlement of its kind in the city's history. And it wasn't enough. No amount of money can give a 15-year-old boy back the years between 15 and 22. No check can undo what Korey Wise endured for 13 years in adult prison. The beatings, the solitary confinement, the slow destruction of a young man's mind and body. No settlement can restore the version of yourself that existed before the world decided you were guilty. Before your face was on the front page, before a billionaire took out a full-page ad calling for your death. In 2012, Ken Burns released a documentary called The Central Park Five, a meticulous, unflinching account of what had happened and why. But it was 2019 that changed the conversation permanently. Ava DuVernay directed When They See Us for Netflix, a 4-part series that showed America, in devastating and personal detail, what had been done to those boys. The series didn't just recount the facts. It made viewers sit in the interrogation room with those children. It made them watch a 16-year-old boy be sent to an adult prison. It made them feel for 4 hours what those families had felt for 13 years. The series was watched by more than 23 million accounts in its first 4 weeks. It didn't just reignite the conversation, it forced people to take sides all over again. Linda Fairstein was dropped by her publisher and forced to resign from nonprofit boards. Elizabeth Lederer stepped down from her teaching position at Columbia Law School. The prosecutors who had built their careers on those convictions found those same careers unraveling. And Donald Trump, who had spent $85,000 calling for the boys' execution before they were even tried, was asked in 2019, as President of the United States, whether he would apologize. His answer was 2 sentences. You have people on both sides of that. They admitted their guilt. In 2022, the northern entrance to Central Park was renamed the Gate of the Exonerated, the first gate in the park to receive a name since 1862. It stands at 110th Street, near the spot where 5 boys entered the park on an April evening and lost everything. In 2023, Yusef Salaam, the boy who had carried a student transit card listing his age, the boy whose mother had stormed into a police precinct demanding to see her son, was elected to the New York City Council, representing Central Harlem. He won in a landslide. He was re-elected in 2025. A 15-year-old boy who was told he was guilty of a crime he didn't commit now writes the laws for the city that convicted him. The boy who carried a student transit card with his birth date on it, the card that should have protected him, the card that proved he was a child, now carries a business card that says New York City Council. If that isn't an American story, nothing is. This case is 35 years old. The DNA has been tested. The real attacker confessed. The convictions were vacated. The settlement was paid. The Gate of the Exonerated stands at the entrance to the park. And still, there are people who believe those 5 boys were involved. Still, there are prosecutors who insist they got it right. Still, there is a former president who has never said the words, "I was wrong." The evidence hasn't changed. The facts haven't changed. What changes is who is looking at them and what they are willing to see. Because this was never really about 5 boys in a park. It was about a city that needed someone to blame, a system that was built to deliver exactly that, and a country that watched it happen and called it justice. Every person who watched those boys be convicted in 1990 believed they were watching the system work. Every newspaper that printed those confessions believed they were informing the public. Every juror who voted guilty believed they were doing their duty. And almost every one of them was wrong. The question this case leaves behind is not whether those 5 boys were innocent. They were. The question is simpler than that, and harder. If it happened in front of the whole country once, and the whole country missed it, how many times has it happened where nobody was watching at all?